Pre-show quid pro quo. Tara, you get one question. It could be any question in the world. It can be about something that happened today. It could be about something that happened in my past. It could be about magic. It could be about anything. Go ahead and ask a question.
Okay. If you could go back to any point in history, when and where would you go and why?
I would go to Alexandria, Egypt in 100 BC. I'm a magician, and I think that Alexandria is our home. It's where a lot of knowledge stayed for a long period of time. There's the stories of Alexandria, Egypt, and when ships would come into the port, they would have to surrender any important documents they have, any philosophical documents or hermetic documents, to the libraries themselves, and the people would take these, they would make copies of them, but they would pull a little switcheroo. They would actually give the copies back to the ships and whoever was on the ships, and they would keep the originals. And I just think the amount of knowledge that probably existed up until that point was crazy, and it's so unfortunate that we lost so much of it. Yeah, that's my answer. Alexandria, Egypt, 100 BC. Tara, that was a great question. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hey everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This? A show that would certainly give its grandmother a call every weekend. Certainly. Also, please give your grandmother a call. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about magic, the occult, the paranormal, the esoteric, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and I am joined by a very, very special guest today. Her name is Tara. Tara, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you, Doug?
I'm doing just fantastic. So Tara is an artist. Anybody can say that they're an artist, but until you see their work, you can kind of be like, they called themselves an artist. But I remember once when your boyfriend started showing me pictures of his phone of your artwork, and I'm not going to exaggerate here, it was some of the most beautiful paintings that I've ever seen by anybody that I know. It was stunning. There were some works in there that just, you made this? How is that even possible? And I remember one specifically, I forget how you did it, but it was of two snakes or one snake, and it was like the scales of the snake were leaping out. And this was just a picture on a phone, and I was, actually an artist. So
it was an Ouroboros, and it was a relief work.
Oh, it was an Ouroboros,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice. Oh, no, it was unbelievable. So it's good to finally have like an actual artist sitting before me, and we've got an absolutely wonderful topic to talk about today. We're heading back to the Fool's Gallery with this one. The Fool's Gallery is kind of a subset section of the podcast, What Magic Is This? And where we talk about certain individuals who have kind of put their own stamp in the world of magic or the occult or the esoteric. And this one is going to be a doozy of a Fool's Gallery, because we're going to be talking about maybe one of my favorite people ever. And his name is William Blake. Some of you might be asking, what the fuck, Doug? This is a magic podcast, and you're going to be talking about William Blake, like an artist. You're going to be talking about this guy. He hasn't written any books about magic. Slide out of the saddle, cowboy. I think that there is quite a lot that we can learn from William Blake, and I will make a very strong case that William Blake definitely belongs in the Fool's Gallery. So let's jump in. But before we start this, I'm going to share a small little anecdote with you. I visited England for the first time the summer of 2018, July and August. I love tons of things about England. I wouldn't say that I'm an Anglophile, but I grew up watching Monty Python. All of my favorite authors were English. I love English history. It's so fascinating to me. So this was a big thing for me. And William Blake was a big reason that I went there. When I first got there, I visited Bunhill Fields, which is a cemetery where he was buried, and I got to see his tombstone. I left a couple of coins for William. That's sometimes what people do. Very cool graveyard, Bunhill Fields. They say maybe 300,000 people were buried there for just centuries. It is literally translated, Bunhill Fields means bone hill. So it was always been a place where people would put bodies. What happened a little bit later on in my trip is that I decided I wanted to visit some of the places that William Blake might have lived. He lived in several areas in London particularly, and I started looking around on Street View, Google Street View, and something very strange happened. He lived in a house on 17 Moulton Street, And as soon as I went there on the Google Street View, it was very strange because both myself and the person I was traveling with had actually been there maybe 3 days before without noticing. I looked and it was like, oh, there's that weird restaurant, Sushi Burrito or something stupid like that. They must be a franchise. It's all over the place. Nope. Oh, no, I was literally here 3 days ago. I don't understand why. I didn't research this. Oh, I'm a bit of an idiot. But this actually kind of, I wouldn't say it was a synchronicity. There's something more here. London's a big place. Why did I find myself in this area? I started looking up places where he lived. I think he lived in 7 or 8 areas in London, and only 2 of them survive. And one of them is 17 Moulton Street, which used to be the residence of the Blake Society. When I went on their website, it said, everybody come to the unveiling of Blake's new tombstone. And I went, what? The Blake Society was going to put a tombstone on the actual spot in Bunhill Fields Cemetery where Blake was buried. His old tombstone was just kind of put anywhere, but they actually were able to find, through documentation, the specific spot where he was buried. And so I went there on August the 12th. It was a lovely ceremony. It was very joyous. Blake would have loved it. A couple of famous people were there. I don't think that Philip Pullman showed up, but Bruce Dickinson of Iron Maiden showed up. It was just a wonderful ceremony. I bought some flowers, joyous occasion, but the fact that I was there for his new tombstone, it really resonated with me, and it was probably the highlight of my trip to London. I've loved William Blake since I was 13, and to be there to see his final resting place, where we actually know his final resting place was an incredibly important thing to me. And that's my little story. We have to ask, who was William Blake? So, William Blake was an 18th to 19th century artist. He was a poet, he was a painter, and he was a printmaker. He worked quite often with engravings. He is lumped in with the Romantics. I think this is a tad unfair because he is so much more than what the Romantics were. I can understand why a lot of people think because what he did right was fairly romantic, but it's also a bit more. William Blake was woefully ignored in his lifetime. His works have since been recognized and been hailed as some of the greatest of all time. In a poll of the 100 greatest Britons of all time, I think it was done kind of at the turn of the century, William Blake came in 38th. His work is hugely inspiring to people of all backgrounds. I know a lot of people will think that because he talks mostly about Britain and the idea of Albion, which is kind of like a spiritual Britain, but his work resonates with people all over the world. He's extremely original. Frustratingly original at some points because some of his later work is seemingly almost impenetrable with its mythology. To those with a vague notion of his life, he seems like that of a solitary figure lost in his own world, making his own art happily for himself, like a bird sitting on a wire just singing to itself. Oh, it's William Blake, and this is extremely unfair. This was not William Blake, incredibly engaged in his time. We do him a disservice by saying that he was this eccentric who just did his thing and then he died, and then later on we found his work and it's all well and good. Blake, he actually saw himself as a visionary and a prophet. He thought that he was tapping into something that had come before him and that his work would live forever, which is a bold claim, but here we are talking about him that many centuries later. Another thing to know about William Blake is he is extremely prolific. He was a very hard worker, and his life, the artist's life, was the most important thing to him. He just produced a ton of work because he would work with engraving and with metal plates. There are different variations and different prints. They get colored very differently. We'll go into an example a little bit later on, but he just never stopped working. He had a puritanical work ethic. So that's William Blake. I'm going to give you a small life story of William Blake. He was born on the 28th of November, 1757. So this podcast is going to be coming out 2 days after his birthday. Parents, they were not wealthy, but they were definitely not poor. His father and his brother were hosiers. They would make stockings. Back in the day, we didn't have a ton of heat, so people would stay warm by putting stockings on, both men and women. His parents were also dissenters. They were not church-going religious, but Blake was baptized. And we can say, though, that the only time that William Blake went into a church for religious reasons was for his baptism, basically. Although he would visit churches for inspiration, he would usually not attend the services or the Mass.
Didn't he get married in a church too?
He did get married in a church as well. But I guess that could be considered, yes, a religious ceremony. We'll talk a little bit about his marriage a little bit later on. One thing that stayed with William Blake from the beginning of his life till the very end was the Bible. He was read the Bible at a very young age, and when he could finally read, he would read sections of the Bible. He had tons of the Bible memorized. Some people say that he had the entire Bible memorized, which is quite incredible. He dropped out of school, I believe, quite young. He was a very headstrong person. He always knew that he was special. He considered himself blessed. When he was going into adulthood, he got an apprenticeship as an engraver for 7 years. Something happened, though, during this apprenticeship. He went to Westminster Abbey in London, and this was one of the most seminal things that ever happened to him in his life. He was there, and he had to do some etchings and some drawings of the tombs in Westminster Abbey. If you've ever been, Westminster Abbey is an incredibly Gothic abbey. I know people have seen the images of the tombs with the kind of the figures of the knights on the top of the tomb, and this just ignited something very, very deeply with William Blake. The lines, it kind of seems like they're flowing. He considered Gothic art to be the most organic form or style of art. He was also incredibly fond of the art of Michelangelo and Raphael. He enjoyed the poetry of Milton. He enjoyed Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and he was a big fan of Dante as well and his Divine Comedy. And when he was a little bit older, he was accepted into the Royal Academy of Arts, which at the time was being run by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And he hated it. He absolutely hated it. He thought that everybody that was going there was just trying to follow what was in at the time, which was, a lot of it was studying the Greek sculptures and perfect proportion for head to body, and it was all very mechanical, and to Blake it just seemed extremely inorganic. It didn't seem
too mathematical for him.
Mathematical, painting by numbers, which would drive somebody like Blake crazy. Blake was very recalcitrant when numbers had to get involved. He just didn't get numbers, strangely enough, and I can definitely sympathize with that. Sir Joshua Reynolds, he thought that Blake was actually dangerous. He thought that he was a charlatan and his style of work was ugly, and that he didn't want him infecting the other students. He didn't last very long at the Royal Academy. He would engrave by day. That was his job. That's how he made his money. He was never rich, ever. Every once in a while, he would have a patron who would sponsor him. But Blake was also a bit of I'm going to say a curmudgeonly man. He would not keep friends for very long. He would piss a lot of people off. He always thought that people didn't see his genius, which is very unfortunate. So yeah, he had to rely on his engraving. He lived very hand to mouth, basically his entire life.
He apprenticed in a style of engraving that at the time was considered old-fashioned and outdated, which didn't help him in his career. He practiced line engraving, and there were two newer forms called stippling and I think it's mezzotint, which allowed for much more gradated forms of engraving that were much more the hot thing at the time. And because of that, his work was also in less demand.
Really? So, poor Blake.
He originally apprenticed under one very, very well-known engraver, but he didn't like that person.
No.
So he ended up going with somebody else who was much lesser known that practiced this older form of engraving that might have contributed to some of his destitution throughout his life.
Poor William. He was very headstrong. He always thought that he was correct in his actions. So yes, he would be engraving by day, but he would also be working on his art at night, or with any kind of free time that he had. He was living that artist's life, which has seemingly never gone away, even to this day. After doing his job, he met the love of his life. Her name was Catherine Boucher. And I just want to preface this by saying that I absolutely adore Catherine, Kate to William. From what I've read in all of the biographies I've read of Blake, I've read about 5. I wish there was more onus paid on their relationship, and I wish there was a book actually written about Catherine, because she seems such an interesting character. She understood him, strangely enough, and she was very patient with William, and he was not an easy man to be around, and she just seemed to have the patience of a saint. paint. Blake also taught her to read and to write. As you mentioned, when they got married in a church. You can go to this church and you can actually see their marriage certificate, and that's right, she signed with a giant X, which is adorable. But they had a very wonderful relationship. They stayed together all the way until Blake passed away. I just adore Catherine. I think that she's a fantastic person, and I really want to hear her story. I really hope that somebody writes a book about her, because she deserves her own story. He was always working, William. He just never stopped. He lived for most of his life in London. There was a period of about 10 years where he lived in Lambeth, and he also lived for a short period of time at a cottage in Felpham. It was here at this cottage that maybe the biggest thing happened to William. He was out and about, and when he came back, there was a soldier that was in his garden. At the time, the Napoleonic Wars were going around, and soldiers training and stationed everywhere in and around England. And he, of course, comes across this soldier. Blake was a huge anti-authoritarian. He did not like the rule to power, and he had a confrontation with this soldier, and things must have gotten very heated because William, I'm going to say this, all of these things that I talk about William, you might see him as like a smaller guy. No, he was full on Cockney. His hands apparently were huge. He was a big guy. He can also be somewhat intimidating. Well, he pushed this soldier down to the ground, grabbed him by his pants and by his collar, and just basically just walked him down a street and pushed him away, apparently saying something about the king. This soldier goes to his superiors and says, this is what happened. And William Blake, he's charged with assault and sedition. There is a trial. Luckily, he was let off. But the experience it made him a little bit bitter. In his art specifically, you can see after that, he retreats fully into his very strange mythology, which I love. But for people that are just first coming to Blake, this is some very hard stuff to get into. It's enormously complex. After this, he has to return to London, and he does. He puts on an exhibition of his work. I believe it was at his brother's house. Very few people come to the exhibition, and it doesn't run for very long. A few of the critics that did decide to come just had nothing good to say about it. They all said it was garbage. It doesn't make any sense. It's terrible form. The lines are all over the place. I don't get it. And that's a very unfortunate thing, because as we're recording this, there is at the Tate in London, there is a giant exhibition going on of his work. Towards the end of his life, he actually got a bit of recognition. It was a group of artists. One of them was Samuel Palmer. They recognized the genius of Blake, and they would hang around with him. They would love to hear stories. They would ask him questions about art, and Blake just loved this. This was like, finally, I have something. They called themselves the Ancients. Samuel Palmer loved Blake so much that when he would walk past his house, he would kiss the doorknob, give it a nice little mwah as he went on his way. They would also do strange stuff where they would ask William to talk about the spirits that he saw and the visions that he had, and they would sometimes do seances with William, which is very cool. On the 12th of August of 1827, Blake was nearing the end of his life. He kind of knew it. He was not fearful in any way. He remarked that he's going to be joining the visions that he saw. He's going to be joining the spirits. He drew a portrait of his wife, Catherine, and put it down and said that Catherine has been and always will be an angel. He sang a few hymns, and he just slowly slipped out of life without any kind of a fight. Catherine stayed by his bedside for a very long time. One of his artist friends who came to visit the now lifeless body of William saw that William's eyes were open, and he came over and he closed William's eyes. He said this was to keep the visions in. So what are some of William Blake's more famous works? Well, the one that I think most people know, if you're living in Europe or specifically England, would be the poem "And Did Those Feet," about Jerusalem, and that perhaps the new Jerusalem would be in England. It was made into a song by Sir Hubert Parry. It's kind of considered the unofficial English anthem. It's okay. It's not my favorite, but it is indeed a very famous work. "And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen?" As far as paintings are concerned, I think the one that most people can recognize is called the Ancient of Days. It is of a kneeling godlike figure with long hair and a beard standing in front of a sun. And there are clouds in the background. The solar winds seem to be blowing the Ancient of Days' beard off to the side. And as he's kneeling down, it's like he's reaching down with a compass. It's a very, very striking figure. In my opinion, this is actually my favorite painting that Blake has ever done. What I love about this painting is, again, he would work from a lot of metal plates, and the metal plates themselves would only provide the outline, and then he would paint over top of them. The variations for the Ancient of Days are quite stunning. You can really see how paint can change the tone of a painting, even if just the outline remains the same, because there's ones where the Ancient of Days, he seems very serene, he's setting the world in order, and then there's another one where it looks like he's the demiurge, really sinister god bestowing order on a world that doesn't need order, and yeah, there's ones that seem like kind of quaint. Another one of my favorite paintings, and one of the more famous paintings, is a painting called Newton. Blake did not like Isaac Newton at all. He thought that Newton was killing the world with rationalism and logic and the new science. He drew a picture of a figure, which would be Newton, sitting on a rock, hunched over, also with a compass in his hand, doing some kind of a calculation on a scroll or a piece of paper. And it looks very pretty, but the point of the painting is not so much the figure of Newton and what he's doing, but what Newton is sitting on, which is a rock that has strange growths and lichen on it. And if you see a high quality or high resolution picture of this painting, the rock is very beautiful and it looks alive. And the point of the painting is that Newton himself is so invested in his calculating that he's ignoring this fecund life that he's just using as furniture that he's sitting on. Another painting called Nebuchadnezzar, and it's a wonderful painting. It was the painting that I saw, or the picture of Blake's that I saw, that first attracted me to Blake. I saw it when I was maybe 13 years old, and my school library had a copy of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. It is of a figure crawling on all fours with elongated fingernails and toenails, and he's looking straight out of the picture. He's got scraggly hair and a beard, and he's got this rictum of torment and pain on its face. His skin seems to be all scaly or like it's falling out, and he just looks like absolute hell. It's an extremely striking painting as well. There's the Ghost of the Flea, which, if you were to take a look at it, you just say, oh, that's an orc from The Lord of the Rings. At one point, William was with a friend of his named John Varley, who was involved in the occult or the esoteric for a little bit. He was an astrologer, and he was bemoaning to William the fact that I don't see spirits. Everybody around me can see spirits. Why can't I see spirits? William, you can see spirits. And William said, indeed I do. And he says, could you draw one of these for me? And William sat for a bit. And he said, yes, wait, something's coming to me now. It's approaching me. It's reaching out for me. Hand me my pen. Hand me my paper. And he starts sketching. And he started first with sketching the head of this beast, and it looks like a reptile goblin. And then he did a separate sketch of the mouth. He wanted to get the mouth correct. And it is a very striking image. The mouth of its tongue is kind of flicking out, and it's got a bowl that it would use to catch the blood. The ghost of a flea, a spirit that William Blake saw. Another big one is the Red Dragon, which is a figure in several paintings, but the most known one was the one that was made famous by the novel Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, which was the introduction of Hannibal Lecter. Anyways, the painting itself is of a creature with wings and 3 heads, all with horns. It's got a large, powerful, serpentine tail. As far as published works, he has the Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. Within this are many poems that have pictures attached to them that relate to the poem itself. It's about childhood, adulthood, and death. It's Blake's own take on such things. They're really wonderful. It's where the poem Tiger comes from, that everybody knows, or also the poem, which is one of my favorite poems of his, called The Garden of Love. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I had never seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. And in the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw that it was filled with graves and tombstones where the flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. Fantastic. It's one of those books that you could give to a child and it could kind of stay with them for the rest of their life. He has the auguries of innocence, and this is probably, besides Tiger or And Did Those Feet, as maybe his most known line, which is, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. And that's just the opening line. It gets better from there. And in fact, I actually think the very end of the poem is my favorite, which is, God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. No doubt Blake was a city poet and he loved London, but he had some not very good things to say about London. London at the time was not a very good place. A lot of debauchery, a lot of prostitution, a lot of conflict, Napoleonic wars, etc., etc. And he came up with the poem London, which is, I wandered through each chartered street where the chartered Thames did flow, and marked in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. I just love the idea of mind-forged manacles. I think each and every one of us has that. His poetry is very simplistic, but its use of repetition and it almost like it has almost a hammering effect to it, I think is something very unique to Blake. Other than that, those are some of the more known things that Blake has done. But he has so much more. As I said, William was a very prolific artist. As this is an occult podcast or a magic podcast, we kind of have to talk a little bit about Blake's more esoteric side. The first thing we need to understand is that Blake was a man of his time. He kind of stood at the precipice of kind of an older way of doing things and the Enlightenment ideas of reason, logic, mathematics, all of the stuff that Newton kind of brought into the world. There was also a lot of occult things happening, places like Paris where you had mesmer and mesmerism, and there'd be another figure that I'm going to bring up as well. William Blake, he was always a weird child. He saw God at the age of 4. At the age of 6, his father beat the shit out of him because he said that he saw angels in a tree. So I think a lot of people get hung up on the fact that there's a lot of religion in Blake's world and in his mythology. And here's what you need to understand. Blake merely used the Bible as a foundation. He saw the figures in the Bible very differently than what we would say they were, and certainly for what they were at the time. These were supposed to be literal figures. For Blake, Jesus was the imagination, pure creativity. It was God's gift to earth. This is my gift. The salvation for the people of earth is imagination / Jesus. As mentioned earlier, Blake considered himself a visionary and a prophet, and he would actually have visions. He would see things. He would see spirits. He would see angels. This was a common thing for him. He was certainly inspired. Again, he also thought he was blessed. He thought he was different. If you would see him walking down the street, he would look like any normal individual, but he lived in an incredibly inspired, rich world. If we were to use the idea of the left brain, right brain split, he was definitely right-brained. Things like mathematics didn't make sense to him. It just didn't seem that it was functional in his world. He saw things very open, very exaggerated. People talk about at the time that William Blake was kind of like a cat. If you ever see a house cat staring off into the distance or staring at an area of the room, it's almost like they see something that you don't and they will meow at it. You know, you kind of just like, are they looking at spirits? This is what people say that William Blake's life was like. He was in his world. A big figure at the time was Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, and he did follow some of the tenets of Swedenborg. He later fell away and kind of did his own thing, as most great visionaries do. Emanuel Swedenborg I talked about briefly in the Astral Projection Soul Flight episode with Camille. He said that he went to heaven and he went to hell. He would visit different planets. He would talk to angels. This was incredibly attractive to Blake, and in some ways I think that he could definitely relate to Emanuel Swedenborg. Blake considered himself part of a tradition and a line of Hermeticism, where the ideas of as above, so below were very, very pertinent to him. He considered this strange lineology of mysticism. And although I wouldn't say that Blake was a mystic or a shaman, he saw himself as a visionary. Like he was seeing things that other people didn't see and that would carry forth through time. He knew he was timeless. Again, he involved himself in a lot of seances and a lot of contacting the dead or contacting other beings. In his club, the club that formed around him, the Ancients, they would do a seance and they would ask him, like, could you draw or could you talk about the people you see in their drawings of the man who built the pyramids or the ghost of a flea, as I mentioned earlier. The question can be asked, was William Blake mentally ill? Was he afflicted with something that we could definitely classify in the DSM-4 or something like that? Or was he a charlatan? Was he just saying that he saw these things and just being that artist, that kind of crazy, kooky person? Because he would say things to great effect to try and prove a point. What is the sun? Do you just see an orb of gas in the sky, a celestial body? No, I see a choir of angels and singing glory to God, holy, holy, holy. I think that William Blake definitely saw the things that he saw. He saw something, and he translated that, and he put it in his artwork. If you go through any of his art, the similarities through so much of his stuff just can't be style. I don't think he suffered from a form of schizophrenia. I think he was so attuned to something else that although we might consider it idiosyncratic or strange, a lot of people and other figures have also done the same and kind of seen this other world. That's kind of what magic is. We're trying to see this other world, and Blake was there. That was his life. That was his living room. He loved the ecstatic. I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here, but I think that he and Catherine probably had fantastic sex. They be fucking constantly. They were very much about the liberation of the body. A lot of his pictures, especially when they involve flowers, look very vaginal. There's a wonderful anecdote of one of Blake's friends dropping by the house in Lambeth, and Blake and Catherine are sitting in their yard, and they're naked as the day that they were born. They just wave, oh, no, come on in. It's just Adam and Eve, nothing to be ashamed about. But I think he got some strange satisfaction. He drew a lot of power from the ecstasy of sex, and Blake was obsessed with druids, antiquarianism. He had this crazy fascination with Stonehenge and monolithic structures. He thought that Britain was a great spiritual place that had lost its way, and that he was one that could kind of bring it back. He could fight off the forces of materialism and reason and logic and mathematics almost single-handedly and usher in this age of the imagination. If there's one word that I would like to attach to William Blake, it's imagination. Not saying that the things that he saw were purely imagination. I think that they actually fueled his imagination. They spurred him to keep going with his creation. A lot of people would say that William had a very Neoplatonic view of the cosmos and heaven, and he certainly has leanings there, but I would make the argument that he was more of an animist. He saw life as a great joyous thing, and that life was in almost absolutely everything, that the world and the universe and the heavens and the spirits that walked beside him and that joined him in his day were there, and that they were as alive as anybody else. I don't understand how anybody who looks at his work could say that he does not live in an alive world, both with humans, non-human entities, and animals. He loved them all. He also said that the interaction between man and the notions of nature, he had a different notion than the Romantics. The Romantics kind of looked at nature and said that nature's this other thing. It's this pristine thing. It's totally separate from mankind. They kind of relegated it, and that's one thing I kind of hate about the Romantics, because they started this whole idea that oh, to see nature, you have to go 50 miles out of the city, get totally out and lost. I don't agree with that. And I certainly think that William Blake would agree with me. He once said that where man is not, nature is barren. It's about the interaction of your perception, your consciousness, and where you find yourself in the world at any point. That is nature, capital N, nature. So I would say that William Blake, A-plus animist. All about the imagination and this gift that each and every one of us has, because we have this unique perspective that we can put onto the world, interpret. This gift is ingrained in each and every one of us. So most of us just forgot how to use it. I think Blake would say that humans are the vehicle through which imagination manifests. He believed in the human capacity. He was not a pessimist in any way, shape, or form. He somehow thought that we were special, and I would definitely agree with him. That the material world to him wasn't the only thing that he saw. This life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and leads you to believe a lie when you see with, not through, the eye. Everything to him was a revelation, and the senses were just the way that these things come through. It's not because of them. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. Blake is definitely an important occult figure in many, many regards. Why does William Blake matter? I think there's a lot of reasons. I think the way to stay inspired by William Blake is somewhat easy. He says that you should just be inspired by everything, by life as you live it. You should create your own world. It needs to have its foundations, so I think that each person should kind of have a metaphysical foundation as to how they see the world. For me, it's animism, but it wasn't always that way. Your metaphysics change over time, but at base, I think from a very early age, I knew that notion that everything is about the elements and cold, dead matter, it never seemed right to me. Another thing about William Blake is that he shows how much hard work matters. Never stop working, and never beat yourself up. Of course, not all of us can make it as an artist for our job. Do as much as you can in as many formats and mediums as you can. He didn't relegate himself to just a poet or just a painter. There are songs that he wrote which unfortunately are lost to time. He would find whatever medium would express what he wanted to communicate best, he would go with. And I think this is a very important thing that artists need to realize, that of course you can be great at painting, but try to stretch in a different direction. Or if you have to say something, what is the best way of saying that? My favorite artists are ones that kind of work in a variety of formats. Do you know who Henry Darger is?
No.
Henry Darger he was born at the end of the 19th century. And he lived until, I believe, the late 70s. He was a very old man. He was as a hospital custodian. And when he passed away in his house and in kind of like his office, they found I think it was 15,000 pages of a book that he had wrote. He wrote an epic story called the Vivian Girls, and it had its own mythology. He would also do paintings of this world that he had. It's a very striking, kind of strange, and what's almost frightening is that a lot of the paintings of strange beings, they look a lot like William Blake's paintings, but he was a loner his entire life, and it wasn't until after he passed away that his works came to be at least recognized by the world. It's great stuff. Lynd Ward is, I think, another very important artist. He mainly worked in one format, which was wood cutting, and he would use that for graphic novels, but what's great about his stories is, as striking as they are, because the woodcuts are very dramatic, is that he didn't use words. He would only tell the story through pictures. A big fan of William Blake would be Alan Moore. I know everybody thinks of Alan Moore as a comic book artist, but he's actually written two very great books. One of them is one of the longest books ever written, called Jerusalem. He also writes songs. Some of them are pretty funny. He's now moved into making movies. One of my other favorite artists, and one that I think is somewhat similar to William Blake, is Hildegard of Bingen. Do you know who she is?
I think so, but I can't say for sure.
Hildegard of Bingen, she was a visionary mystic. She wrote a lot of choral music. Her writings are very mystical. Her illustrations are crazy with strange fumes coming out of people's eyes. And there's one with a almost looks like a UFO with an umbilical cord attached to a pregnant woman. Anyways, William Blake, he didn't pay any mind to criticism. People would shit all over him, and he didn't care. Also, his process, his whole process of creating his artwork was, it was almost like a magical act. It was like a ritual for him, and he realized that the process was as important as the finished product to him. Other figures, when we're talking about Blake and his strange world that he lived in, there's some figures that pop up. One of them would be Carl Jung. More specifically, when Carl Jung was going through what was called his creative illness, he said he was talking to things within his head, but it would almost appear like they were beside him. Figures like Philemon or Salome. I think that Blake was kind of the same. What's strange is that was kind of his entire life. He never stopped being in this strange, otherworldly place of spirits and angels. Because for him, I think he was far more comfortable there than most people. Jung could only stay there for a short period of time. I think for Blake, that was home. That was home for him. The last thing that we can say about why Blake matters is that he knew that he was going to be known. He was so assured of what he did. He said that his work was dedicated to children of a future age. He actually used those words. He was so assured that what he was doing was going to live on. We have to take a little bit of a right angle here and talk a bit about the idea of art and magic. So magic has sometimes been called the science and art of making things you want happen in your life. I'm butchering Aleister Crowley here, but he uses the word science, and I've never been a fan of the idea of magic as science. I think it falls apart very easily. Magic does have techniques, and it does have a technology, certainly, but I find it more closely relates to art than it does with science. I would never say that magic is art. I know others have made that distinction. I don't think I can go there. Magic and art share that formulation for creation.
It's not a recipe.
It's not a recipe. It's not like baking. It is a formulation and a ritual to create something. And it's there to change consciousness. And if not just your own, then perhaps other people's. I can think of no better vehicle for changing consciousness than art, whether it be a piece of music, whether it be in a painting. I have seen paintings that when I look at it, I could stay there for hours. It's almost like I have to snap myself out. There is no better vehicle for changing consciousness than art. Art allows you to see these other worlds. And when you look at Blake's art, you are looking at Blake's world. You look at Blake, you see Blake's world. I would just want to say this. If you're an artist, I think you should do a little bit of magic in some small way. I think you should be a little bit of a dirt sorcerer. I think it might help you a little bit. I'm not just speaking to you, Tara. I'm sorry. I'm talking in general here. Do some weird stuff. Do some experimenting. You know, there's some spells you can look at. Just see if it helps a little bit. And if you're a magician, I would say do some fucking art. Magician, not just art to look pretty or to hang around the house. I think within your magic itself, there's not just instead of writing down sigils on pieces of paper with a pen, do something creative. Get some clay, put your sigils in clay. There's other ways that you can utilize different mediums to actually bolster your spells. So magicians should do art, and artists should do some magic. It's about enchanting your world, this whole magic thing.
It's about opening doors in your head and in your soul.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. And magicians and artists, they stay on that strange liminal territory that they share, which I think is about consciousness change. If this idea of magic and art is kind of big for you, I will be doing an episode in the future specifically on art and magic. Somebody who goes into this far better than I do is Alan Moore. Perhaps one of two documents that changed absolutely everything for me as far as my magic and occult studies was an article that Alan Moore released called Fossil Angels, and I read that back in 2010. Yes, he makes the argument that hey, look at this weird, strange, old lodge magic, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Enochian magic stuff. It's a museum piece. Let's try to think of magic as art now. You have to read this essay. Everybody needs to read this. Specifically for those people that have been doing magic for a long period of time. I'd say if you've been doing magic for 7 to 15 years and you haven't read Fossil Angels, do yourself a favor and read that. The other text that I read was a book called Apocalyptic Witchcraft by Peter Gray, and I read that back in 2015, I think. It also talks a lot about art and animism, but I'd say the best thing to go for would be Fossil Angels by Alan Moore. So let's talk a little bit about systems, because everybody should have a little system of magic, and some people have other people's systems of magic. I think Blake put it best when he says, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create. So you can take things from other systems, but you should really at bottom be creating your own system. And this goes for artists as well, I'd like to think. Say you've studied the Kabbalah or astrology or Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. You've learned all of this, and now your magic seems a little slight, or it doesn't have the same effect that it had before. Maybe it's not as enchanting to you. You need to switch things up. I will put up on the show notes an essay by Mitch Horowitz that talks about anarchic magic. Once you have assimilated the rule books, as the case may be, you must throw them away and dance on the edges of your intuition. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Blake understood this all too well. To do otherwise for Blake was absolute madness. Most people considered him mad when he was alive, let alone after he died. But he considered everybody else to be insane, or if not insane, worse, inane. What I'm trying to say is you have to be like Blake. Be a curmudgeon for certain things. Don't be an asshole, but be honest with yourself. Trust your process, but always expand it. That's another thing. Try to add things that work, things that don't work, let it slide away. Constantly try to expand your system. Fuck the haters and stay true to yourself. And you might not ever be recognized, but maybe sometime you will. You never know. It's unfortunate that it doesn't happen in your life, but who cares? That is far more functional for you as a human being than trying to do things by the numbers or what is popular. And doing what is popular will certainly probably pay your bills, but I don't know if it will feed the soul kind of thing.
Well, I think the art that lasts through the ages is that produced by people who are true to themselves and true to what their vision is and their art. They're drawing on something that is timeless.
Yeah.
It's not a construct.
It's not tethered to any one point or any one time.
So each new generation of people can find something in it, and therefore it lives.
Absolutely. I would agree. Have high expectations of yourself, but also have high expectations of others, especially artists. I'm not trying to talk about this. This isn't like a Dr. Phil encompassing life. People. I'm trying to specifically talk about people that create art or magic. Have high expectations of them, also of yourself. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. I am often told that I am a curmudgeon and that I hate everything. Perhaps. But what I will say is that I really dislike mediocrity. I can't stand things that are just milquetoast. I talked about it a little bit before in the imagination episode. I get this very strange feeling. It almost feels like my spine is breathing or expanding or pulsing when I'm reading or listening or looking at highly imaginative or original things or things I haven't seen before. It's a very strange sensation, but it's been with me my entire life. If I don't get that feeling from something that you're doing, if you're not engaging me and making my spine breathe, you best be making my brain work. This idea of originality is, I think, very, very, very important. Let me ask you, would you agree that originality is not dead, but it's definitely not as prevalent as it once was?
I would say definitely in the realm of film and television, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say that there's too much of a focus on communicating a specific predetermined message rather than birthing something.
Right.
It makes it artificial.
Right.
It's subservient to ideology right now.
It's unfortunate. How did it get like this? Just the times, eh?
It's just the times.
Just the times. Do you think we're ever going to get out of it?
Yeah.
I hope so.
I do. I hope
really
so too.
do.
I think we will outgrow it as a society. It's a phase.
I can't wait. I really can't wait. When you're doing magic, you are doing what's called the great work, or it was also called the art. If you're a magician, you got to do some art. if you're an artist, I think you should do a little bit of magic. Just a little bit.
It's good advice.
Yeah, just a wee bit. And I'm going to give the last word to William here. He said in one of his letters, "I rest not from my great task to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards into the world of thought, into eternity." If you want to get a bit of Blake in your life, how do you do this? Well, look at some of William Blake's work. First of all, I mean, he was an artist and he was a poet. You gotta see some of his art. You gotta read some of his poetry. I like the fact that William Blake was a poet of the city. One of the things that I used to do is that I used to take my old Norton Critical Edition, Blake's Poetry and Designs, edited by Mary Lynn Johnson and John E. Grant, and I would walk around the city and I would find a little park for a little bit of seclusion, and I would read some Blake, and then I would stop, and then I would keep walking, and I'd find another park, sit, read a bit more Blake, and I would do this. I think this is a very good way of getting in touch with William Blake. I think one of the best books you can get is called William Blake: The Complete Illuminated Books. You were looking at it earlier. I keep it very close at hand. It never goes away, except No Substitute. That was absolutely the best. A strange thing happened when I was attending the unveiling of William Blake's new tombstone. Lita Cardozo, who was the person who designed the tombstone, was there, and it was a very sweet moment between the two of us because I was there alone and most people had already gone, and I was just sitting looking. I was having my moment with William. Lita, she walked up to me and she basically took a step back and she said, "How did William Blake come into your life?" And I told her about the marriage of heaven and hell and seeing the picture of Nebuchadnezzar. And she said, "It's funny how Blake seems to come into our lives at exactly the right moment." And both of us kind of looked at each other, we nodded and we smiled, and she went elsewhere and I went elsewhere. It was a very sweet moment for us. But it's true, William kind of came into my life at exactly the right moment. And I know of a lot of people, especially those that were attending that unveiling of his tombstone, that would say the exact same. If you want to read about William Blake, specifically kind of analysis of his works, you have to find the work of Kathleen Raine. She was a poet. Her works about William Blake, specifically Blake and tradition, are wonderful. She is the best. I know a lot of people would say, and because he's very popular, especially in this city of Toronto, Northrop Frye, he wrote a book called Fearful Symmetry. I don't like that book. It's far too scholarly, and I'm just going to use the word bloodless. If you want the blood of Blake in analysis, you have to go to Kathleen. She is the best. If you want to read biographies of Blake, I can suggest two. There's Peter Ackroyd's Blake, and a newer book that just came out by Tobias Churton called Jerusalem. Really great book. Those two are probably the best biographies of William that you can find. There's two books going to be coming out in the next little while here, or one is already out, one's going to be released by maybe one of my favorite authors alive right now by the name of John Higgs. He's got a book, it's called William Blake Now, Why Blake Matters Now More Than Ever, and he's got a book coming out called William Blake versus the World. I have not read these books. I can't say how good they will be, but I love John Higgs and they will probably be fantastic. One of the more strange resources I'm going to suggest here is Alan Moore did a spoken word record about William Blake called Angel Passage. It is incredibly difficult to find, but it is wonderful. You can tell that Alan Moore loved William Blake, and the very last track is about the final day of William Blake's life. And if that doesn't make you cry, you do not have a heart. I'm just going to put it that way. But try to find Angel Passage. It's fantastic. Some things that are not Blake related, but maybe are. There's a book called Heart of the Original by Steve Aylett. It goes into originality and why it's a dying beast and why people are shocked by original ideas and settle for mediocrity. This is the book. It's very short. You can read it in like 2 hours. The stuff that you can get out of it, the original works of art that he mentions in this book are stunning. I've probably spent over $500 getting the books that he mentioned and finding the things. If you want a book about originality that is itself a very original book, Heart of the Original by Steve Aylett. Another thing would be a book I've mentioned in the Imagination episode, a book by Gary Lockman called Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. Wonderful, just fantastic book. He talks about Kathleen Raine, he talks about William Blake, and also the two things that I mentioned earlier. Specifically, if you're a magician, get these: Apocalyptic Witchcraft by Peter Gray and Fossil Angels by Alan Moore. That's it. That's William Blake. If you can't tell, I absolutely adore William Blake. I think that his work will be here long after you and I are gone. I think it is timeless. I don't think it will ever go away. And I would hope that each and every one of us has this capacity and is able to find it in ourselves. And yeah, I hope that my love for him is palpable, and thank you so much for choosing him, Tara. I could not wait to talk about William Blake, as you can tell. That's the episode on William Blake, everybody. For those of you curious, head to whatmagicisthis.com. There you will find links to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, Facebook account. On there, you can find ways to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Radio Public, TuneIn, YouTube, and many, many more. If they have podcasts, I'm going to be there. Also on my website, guys, I've got show notes. They're awesome, if I do say so myself. I really got on my way for these show notes. I've gotten some feedback recently from people saying that, dude, your show notes are quite excellent. I've got like 5 new books to read now. And I'm like, good. That's half of the reason that I'm doing this is to share. I love sharing with people, and this podcast is a great way of being able to share. If you like my show, please leave a rating on Google Play or iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify. It would be greatly appreciated. If you feel like writing something about me, that would make you one of my favorite people ever. So please try to leave me a rating. My numbers have been going up, but people are listening and people are giving me feedback. It's good to see. It keeps me going. If you do feel like contacting me through any of these formats, I will reply. I promise you now, I will reply to you, and sometimes it might be a very long reply. I apologize for that. I have a lot to say. And with that, we will end the episode with the post-show quid pro quo. Tara, are you ready?
I hope so.
Okay, Tara, here we go. You might have to think about this one, but we're going to go anyway. At any point when you were creating art, have you ever felt like there was something else there? Was there a feeling like something was guiding your actions in creating your art, or maybe that you felt this strange connection to something outside yourself in some strange way?
I wouldn't put it in quite those terms.
Okay.
I would say the artistic process for me is always a dialogue, and one of putting on paper and listening and meditating, and then tweaking and putting on paper and listening and meditating. I've never had the sensation of there being almost an entity or something that is definable and separate from me. Not quite an experience like that, but I would say that it is an inward journey and something that I don't decide.
Is it like a dialogue with the soul, or with some kind of idea or thought, or...
I don't know. I wouldn't say I know where it comes from. You open up a part of your mind and a part of your spirit, and you receive. Mm-hmm. And what it is that is being received, I don't know. I don't know if that is just elements of the unconscious that have a chance to emerge and have their say, or if that is something that comes from outside of oneself, if that is, the collective unconscious, if that is a spirit, if that is a demon, if that is anything like that, I don't know. But for me, it's always been the joy of the process, because you have a kernel of an idea, and then that starts you on a path, and more often than not, you don't end up where you think you're going to.
Right.
And that's the joy of the journey of creating something, seeing where it takes you, and opening yourself up to wherever that ends up being, and trying not to control the process.
Nice.
Yeah.
Stay out of the way.
Yeah, stay out of the way.
Yeah.
Stay out of the way and listen.
Right.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Amazing. Tara, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure, Doug. Thank you.
It's been amazing, and I can't wait to have you back. If you would like to come back.
Absolutely.
I will talk your ears off once more.
And
if you should let me.
I will listen raptly.
Tara, thank you again.
My pleasure, Doug.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. This has been What Magic Is This? My name is Douglas Batchelor, and we will talk at you soon. Bye-bye.